A completely black or blank frame with no visible content.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Tsunamis Voices in the Court of Discovery 2. Tell you guys a little bit about us if you haven't joined us before. We are a traveling exhibit. We've been traveling the trail since January of 2003. When we started out at Monticello at Thomas Jefferson's home, made our way westward to the Pacific Ocean. And next year we'll be doing the return trip back to St. Louis. We'll open up March 13th in St. Helens, Oregon as well. We call this the Tsunamis Voices because we bring in people from all over the country to do programs for us, to tell the Lewis Clark story, as long with the Native American story as well, the over 50 different tribes they met along the way. Today we have with us Doug Durr, who's from the University of Washington, and he's going to be talking about the Clatsop and the Chinookan living on the land. So please welcome Doug.
Hello, and thank you very much for showing up today. As was said, my name is Doug Durr, and I'm a researcher with the University of Washington. I work with tribes all over the West, trying to document things like traditional environmental knowledge and historical knowledge tied to particular places on the landscape. And I do this through the University of Washington and through other connections, working directly with American Indian tribes around the western part of North America. Through the University of Washington, through the University of Victoria, where I'm adjunct professor as well at the University of Victoria School of Environmental Studies. And the Clatsop and the Chinookan, though, from here, the people who lived here are of particular interest. Because this is home to me here. This is where I'm from. And the part of my family where we have a written record, they washed ashore here in the 1840s and developed connections with the tribes living here. They wash ashore and actually take up homesteads here in Seaside, just a stone's throw from the large village that was out here. And so we have these long connections going back. And so those connections continue today. And we know, though, that these people who are here, Clatsop primarily, but also the Nehalem or Northern Tillamook people who were up here some of the time, Chinookan people from up north, they were here for a very, very long period of time. They learned a lot about.
A person wearing a dark shirt and a maroon zip-up jacket stands indoors, facing left. Behind them is a dark panel with partial text visible and a brass-colored lamp. The background is a light gray wall.
How to live in this place, and there's been a lot that we have learned, we being people from the outside, being my family, being researchers, had learned from these families about how to live here and how to live here well. And so over the years, the Clatsop people, the people who lived here in Seaside, have been scattered in a number of different directions, and today we have people who Clatsop who went north. Some of them went up across the river, and those people ultimately became part of what we now know as the Chinook Nation, or the Quinault Nation further north. And we have people who got scattered at the south as settlers came through and started to move into the area, who ended up going south. And some of those people became part of what became the Siletz tribe, the Grand Ronde tribe, and the Clatsop and the Chinookan people, who are a mixture of people from different communities up and down the coast. And so the Clatsop people today have scattered. The people who lived here, the descendants of the people who lived here have scattered, and yet they're still around. In fact, I'd like to ask if there's anybody here who's a descendant of Clatsop, Chinook, Nehalem, or Tillamook people. Anybody? Interesting. It's the first talk I've given in a while where we haven't had a few of those folks here. There are a lot of them around, and even though we tend to think about these people having disappeared, this is what you hear in all the textbooks, the truth is they survived and they adapted. They married into other tribes, but they also married into the white families coming in from the outside. And they became a seamless part of the community. And today, ironically, when I do the numbers, I see that the number of people living today who are descended from the communities right here in the seaside is larger than the number of people who were here when Lewis and Clark were here. They have more living descendants today. That doesn't mean that the Clatsop people are all living exactly as they did 200 years ago, but they haven't disappeared. They've become part of a much more complex sort of social fabric out there. And so I've had the privilege of working with a lot of their elders and working a lot with the written materials, things that their grandparents and great-grandparents told people who were passing through the area. And so it's on the basis of that information that I talk today about the history of this very immediate area here and this way of life that has in some ways been swept away, even if the people themselves carry on today. But I think it's very important, if you leave here, to know that at very least these people haven't disappeared. It isn't an extinct people like you read in all the textbooks. We really have descendants all over, some living here in Seaside, some still practicing certain parts of their cultural tradition. But that being said, I'm going to talk a lot about people as they lived in the past. I'm not going to talk so much about
A person wearing a dark red button-up shirt stands indoors against a blue and gray backdrop with gold trim. They are looking off to the side while speaking, with a microphone visible on their shirt.
How modern-day Clatsops drive around in SUVs and go to the grocery store and do things there, though that's what they do. But instead, talk a little bit about just how these people lived here on the land. We know that there were several large villages right here in the seaside area, right along the tidal flats, right along where the estuaries are. And the people of this area fundamentally were people of that estuary. And an estuary is a place where we have the fresh water come down and mix into the ocean, and you get water that's a little bit salt, a little bit fresh, all mixed together. And you get all kinds of things happening there. That's where the salmon first come in, and where you can catch the salmon. That's where the clams are. All the different clams that the Clatsop people here survived on are all found there in that estuary. A lot of other fish that you don't hear as much about, the flounder. They had distinctive ways of catching flounder right out here. You go out in the Chinookan estuary, in the mouth there, you can see all those shallow areas, and the flounder used to be thick there. And some people can still remember seeing their grandmothers go out and catch those fish by coming up it.
A person wearing a dark red shirt sits indoors speaking. Behind them is a wooden panel with a brass lamp visible on top. Text overlay appears at the bottom of the frame.
Jumping on them. You can actually get them because they're nice flat fish. And so you can catch them under your feet. And you can hold them until you can reach down and snag one. And so there are all kinds of things like that to be found there. The roots that grow in the tide flats, almost everything that grows in the tide flats has some traditional use. And unfortunately, this time of the year, there isn't a lot of those things out there. There aren't those things out there to see on the landscape. I tried to gather plants to show you, and most of the plants I wanted to show you have turned brown and washed away because it's the wrong time of the year. And what this means too is that even though Lewis and Clark were here at this time of the year, observing things very carefully, they missed a lot because they were only here for a narrow period of time, which is ordinarily a very wet, rainy period of time. Because I'll have to take my word for that. And so, all the things they needed really were clustered around that estuary. We have the slough sedge grows on the sloughs right along those tidal flats. Also called the basket sedge. People use this to make basketry. And the roots can be used for that, but also these pieces can be stripped and woven together and turned into nice mats and that kind of thing. So part of why I'm standing down here is so if anybody's interested, I can hand these things around so you can get a feel for them. Slough sedge, that's right, or basket sedge. Carex ornata, for those who are taking notes. It's a plant that grows all.
A person in a burgundy jacket stands at a podium on a stage, gesturing while speaking. Behind them, text displays agency names including the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Department of Energy.
We have a couple of types of sedges that grow in the tide flats, and the roots of these, to this day, there are some tribal elders who still take care of these plants. They go into there, they churn up the soil around where these plants grow. They pull out only the roots they need, and then they churn up the soil some more all around the perimeter. And what that does is it allows those roots to expand without a lot of friction, without hitting rocks, without hitting solid dirt. And what that does is make nice, long roots, and those roots are the best ones to use for making baskets. And And so there's a lot of that kind of knowledge that still persists today. The tops can also be made into various things too, but there's the management of the land really is tied to taking care of those roots, making sure that those work. A lot of food plants can be found there in the tide flats as well. One that I can't show you here, but which is all over, is a plant that the Nehalem people, at least we know, I don't know what it was called in Clatsop, but the Nehalem people called it Yitzka. And it's a root that comes up as a flower kind of like a buttercup, and you'll see it out in the tide flats here. If you know how to cook the roots, and this is about the right time to gather them, it tastes just like a sweet potato. And it was one of the primary starch foods that was going to offset all that salmon and clams and everything else that people ate here. Very important plant. And when you go out at the right time of the year and you look out over those tide flats, it's like you're in your SUV driving to the grocery store. There's everything you need out there. You have all the plants to eat, all the plants to make your baskets, all the plants you need to do medicinal work, all those things out there on the tide flats. And there on the tide flats too, people traditionally fished around here. And up and down this coast, we have some hint of how that worked. There's one elder I've had the opportunity to work with, Joe Scoville, who was one of the last people raised in the community that was sometimes called Squaw Town, Hobsonville, down in northern Tillamook Bay. And some of his ancestors came from the village here in Seaside, but by the time that the 20th century rolled around, a lot of them were moving north and south, and these people went south down to Tillamook Bay. And that family has stories about how the hereditary chiefs in that community would take care of the fish as they would come up through those tide flats. They had strong beliefs that these fish were sentient beings like ourselves, willing to make the decision to come up and to give their life so that we might live here. And so they didn't want to disturb that. They didn't want to offend the fish by catching too many fish, by using the fish wastefully. And so the hereditary chiefs would walk up and down along the shoreline as people were fishing, and they would regulate that. They would tell people when they were going to set in the nets they had. They would tell people when they would stop fishing, when they would pull those nets out, when they would stop fishing.
A person wearing a dark red button-up shirt stands on a stage speaking, with their hands gestures in front of them. Behind them is a display screen showing an interior space. Text overlays are visible along the bottom and right edges of the frame.
Because they knew that they had reached a point where they could take care of their own needs for food, they could take care of their needs for trade, but they weren't going to take much more than that, because they knew that if they did that, according to their traditions, the fish would choose not to come back. Not so much because you would overexploit them, which is how our modern day resource managers might try to explain that same thing, but because the fish had felt violated by that has overstepped our bounds, that had gone outside of our relationship that we have with those fish. And we know that probably over a very long period of time, these people had the opportunity to witness cause and effect. They saw people a couple villages down catch too many fish. The fish don't come back much after you keep pulling out too many fish year after year after year. And those fish don't come back, and you learn that, and that becomes part of your oral tradition, part of your stories that you then pass on to your children and to your grandchildren, to make sure that they're okay, to make sure that not only do you maintain that relationship, but to make sure that your family survives, that they have food to eat in generations ahead. So it's important that that knowledge gets passed along within these traditions. And in fact, doing the work I do up and down the coast, it's been amazing for me to encounter I work with a few elders who were raised very traditionally, raised by families where they didn't speak English, raised by families that intentionally went out of their way to not to teach the children things about the outside world. And I've sat there with elders who are just from a little ways up the coast, speaking in broken English about how their great-grandparents taught them that there were certain things to do with the fish. One of the things I do, in addition to working with tribes, is I help with salmon habitat restoration work. And we know that we can take very good care of those streams. We can stop all the fishing. We can make the water quality just perfect, get everything right. And still sometimes the fish don't come back. And one of the reasons the fish don't come back is because if the stream has lost all of its salmon, there are no salmon carcasses in the water to feed the little bugs. And And if there are no little bugs, there's nothing to feed the little fish. It's a very interesting thing. Salmon leave here. They're little tiny fish like this. They swim out in the ocean. They come back like this. So they're feeding on things out there in the water, shrimp and little fish. And all of that stuff that they accumulate in their bodies comes back up with them. And it comes into these streams. And they spawn and they die, and their bodies are used to feed all the little things in the stream. We found that hundreds of different species depend on those carcasses for their survival. And one of the species that depends on those carcasses for their survival are the young salmon themselves, because they eat the bugs that eat their own family. And so
A person in a maroon jacket stands indoors, gesturing while speaking. Behind them is a large screen displaying partial text about government agencies and conservation services. The setting appears to be an indoor presentation or interview space.
We have now gotten to the point with salmon habitat restoration where we take carcasses from places like seafood operations, take those carcasses and put them in the water, and the fish start to come back because there's something that you're getting the nutrients kick-started within that system. And so it's fascinating me to work with tribal elders who say to me, and again, great-grandparents, born in the mid-19th century, who never heard anything about this modern science, they will tell their grandchildren, we've been told that we have to put the carcasses back in the water. We do that because the fish need that so they can come back. Their physical body becomes part of the body of the next generation. If we don't do that, the fish won't be able to come back. And if you don't do that, they'll be offended and they will refuse to come back. And that's interesting, because this is cutting-edge science I'm talking about with this fish carcass stuff. And here we have confirmation of voice coming in from the 19th century to tell us how to do it right. And for me, that's exciting, because I can take that back to these resource specialists, modern-day scientists, and say, look what the tribal elders are telling us. They're telling us we have to do these certain things in relation to the fish. And most people who come from a natural resource background think that we're going to tell them, well, you have to chant certain words and spin in circles 3 times. That's not the kind of knowledge that's coming down to me from these people. It's very practical knowledge. It's how do you keep your family living? How do you survive? How do you keep your children alive? How do you keep your grandchildren alive? So that's the kind of knowledge that gets passed down through these oral traditions. It's a form of scientific knowledge, but it's being passed down in a society where you don't have writing. So you teach children these things at a very early age. You teach them how to navigate those things and to survive. Also down here around the, I'll double back to that point a little bit. I think that that's an important point in terms of how to navigate and how to survive. But I should move up now from the tidal flats, move up a little bit higher. The edge of the tidal flats, that area between the ocean and the big forests back here. And we know that the people right here in this area, Clatsop people, Tillamook people, Chinook people, all took care of the land in various ways. One of those ways was to burn the plants out from along the edge of that contact point between the forest and the tide flats. And we know that the areas around the perimeters of the big villages, as you went further out, those areas were full of good berry picking areas, areas where people took care of those berry patches and made sure that those things grow well. A lot of the berries that you find around here will do okay. They will survive if they're down under the forest canopy, but they're not going to thrive. They're not going to put on many berries. They're not going to really put out enough berries that you could actually feed your own family. And so what we see here is that there's a tradition of burning.
A person wearing a burgundy shirt gestures while speaking in front of a large black panel with partial text visible reading Ion Service. OS engineers, and the interior.
Edges of the forest, going out and starting those fires and clearing back those edges a little bit. And so we have stories from the elders passed down about all around the edges of what is now Seaside, as you go around back along the edges of the hills, sort of in that area between the tidal flats and back in the trees, all that area being excellent berry picking at one time. Now it's an excellent place to go buy a house, I guess. There's a lot of suburban yards there now, and berry picking areas are kind of few and far between. But those areas were very important, and there's still places around today where you can go and see evidence of that. If you walk across the land here in Ecola Park, there's some little areas where you'll still see berries growing, and it seems strange because the forest should be covering it, but it's not. The forest is back a little ways. Now the forest is moving in slowly, taking over those areas now because nobody's taking care of that land. But you can still find those places. Neocani Mountain, if you go a little further south in Oswald West State Park, south of us here. As you drive through that area, if you're heading south along Highway 101, you look back on the south side, that hill slope still doesn't have many trees on it. Trees are moving in fast because nobody's burning it anymore. But that whole hill slope used to be burned. And there are excellent places there still to go pick thimbleberries and things like that, because people took care of those places for years and years and years and years, knowing that those plants would come back up.
A person in a dark red jacket stands at a podium on a small stage. Text on a banner behind them reads Conservation and U.S. Army Corps of and RGY, Department of.
Also in those areas were some plants like camas. I wanted to show you one of those, but it's one of these plants that was said to be among the most important in the diets of all the people along the North Coast. It's a plant that's very pretty. It has a blue flower that comes up in the springtime, and it's so pretty, in fact, that gardeners buy it now out of old catalogs, right there with their tulips. And they put those in their yard, and those blue flowers come up, and they're spectacular. They come up for just a little while, and they go to seed and drop back down. And the bulb is edible, and if you can bake that, you know how to do that right. It's very sweet, very tasty. And a lot of the elders around the turn of the previous century reported to anthropologists coming through that the camas was one of their most important plants, right up there with that Yesco root I was telling you about on the tide flats. And also, this plant grew right along the edges, sort of wet margins where people were burning to take care of it. And why I have all this buildup to tell you about this great camas plant is because I can't find you any to show you anymore, because they were taking care of it, and nobody's out there anymore taking care of it. Nobody's burning those places to keep the forest back. And the places where it was growing have also been built over. And today, camas is an extremely rare plant on this part of the coast. It is rare enough that people, say from the Nature Conservancy, other organizations that take care of rare plants, get kind of excited when they see it around here. It's a plant that's been rapidly disappearing, and yet 100 years ago, elders were saying they remember it was a staple plant. They knew all about how to dig it, where you could go get it, fields that used to be full of it. Early explorers coming through here described these meadows of blue flowers in the springtime that were spectacular. And without people taking care of those places, without burning back the forest vegetation along the edges, and people coming in, building over the tops of those places, bringing in livestock early on. Pigs love camas. They get in, they root up for those camas bulbs, they dig up the ground, and they eat up big patches. And in fact, in some parts of the Northwest, settlers coming in and reoccupying those camas patches actually started off wars. There are fairly significant battles that took place in eastern Oregon when tribes, camas plots that they'd taken care of for generation after generation were being occupied by people coming in with livestock. For the outsider,
A person in a dark red shirt stands at a podium. Behind them is a screen displaying text that reads as Conservation S and U.S. Army Corps of and Department of.
See those things, they say, what a great meadow. It's a nice natural spot. I'll set my animals loose, not realizing what kind of investment of labor and personal energy and all those things that went into that particular piece of land that looks so nice. It looks like a nice natural meadow. The Wapato? The Wapato. That's a good question. The Wapato doesn't really grow down here on the coast. It grows, a few of them grow here on the coast, but the big Wapato grounds were further up the Columbia River. The Wapato is a fascinating plant, and even though it's not from this area, I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about it because it's so close. That's right, and it was available in large quantities through trade from just upriver. The real central core of Wapato gathering along this entire coast is the zone from about Portland to Longview, what some people call Wapato Valley historically. That's another plant that's becoming increasingly rare, although here and there on places like Sauby's Island, outside of Portland, you still see wapato growing in some of these natural little swales. And wapato, it's actually Chinese food. You have little white things. Water chestnut is a relative of that. Sagittarius, they're both the same. No, but they're both the same genus. And so if you want an idea of what that's like, it's kind of, people call it the Indian potato around here sometimes, but it's the same basic size, little round bulblet that grows in wetland areas up on the Columbia. And in fact, it likes a very specific kind of wetland area, which is a real interesting thing. It's one of the things the science books, I was talking about estuaries here, where the salt water all mixes in. Textbooks never talk with you much about intertidal freshwater wetlands, but that's in fact what the wapato really likes. Because the Columbia River, it hits that incoming tide, and what happens is you get salt water in the mouth of the Columbia River, but the further up you go, you no longer get much salt water, but what you get is the tide still affecting the river level. So the river all the way up into Portland is going up and down with the tide, even though there's no salt water that gets that far up. And so the wapato is sort of uniquely suited for that kind of environment where you have the water levels going up and down and up and down. It's actually a plant that can grow right in the water. So you have the bulblet in the mud and then a long stem coming up and the leaves and a pretty little white flower up at the top. And those were gathered by the Chinookan people from just a little bit upriver. And the Clatsops down here had families up there. They had kinship ties to the people all the way up the river and trade ties and everything else. And so
A person wearing a dark red button-up shirt stands indoors looking downward. Behind them is a projection screen displaying partial text including words like cult, Rezaork, army, and energy.
So they traded things down here that they had for wapato from just up the river. They were slightly different people, but they spoke more or less the same language, and they had these kinds of connections. And so people down here, for example, would have things they would gather. Whale oil was an important commodity, and seal meat and seal oil, things you can get down here along the waterfront. They also made very good canoes down here. Sometimes those were traded further upriver. And they would trade those for a variety of different things, and wapato would be one of those things they could get. Also, for that matter, some of the people from down here seem to have had kind of de facto plant gathering rights upriver because of those family ties. And so you actually hear stories clear into the late 19th century of people jumping in canoes from all the communities along the coast and going up the Columbia, both to fish salmon at some of the falls, all the way up to Bonneville, Celilo area, but also gathering wapatos that came back down through. And so it wasn't a plant that really grew much here, but it was one that was close enough and they had access to. And so it was a very important part of the trading economy here, and Lewis Clark pick up on that. It's also a very good plant to store, so most of the plants that Lewis and Clark are talking about, they're not actually seeing people out gathering much of this stuff because it's the winter time and it's not the time to gather berries. It's not the time to gather most of these plants. But they are seeing those plants coming through, and those wapato are being traded all up and down the river, all through the winter time, taking care of people. So. Okay, right. It can be propagated here, yeah. It does well in wetland setting. So you can put it in, if you have a pond in your yard, you can get some going, a nice muddy base. If the water isn't too stagnant, you need a little bit of flushing. And then I'll go further back up into the mountains, come back down for a while, and then we can open up for more questions here. These are good questions. But taking things up further into the mountains, some of the big mountains, unfortunately we can't see it here, but if you were to just walk out anywhere at Seaside and look up, you can see these big mountains all around here. We have Saddle Mountain, and we have Sugarloaf Mountain, and we have Onion Peak, and we have Angora Peak. These are all this ridge of mountains, about 3,000 feet high at the tops, going more or less from northeast to southwest, terminating, hitting the ocean where Neocani Mountain is. And the tops of those peaks are high enough that everything's a little bit different up there. And we know that while I'm talking about the people of this part of the world spending a lot of time down along the tide flats, spending a lot of time around these estuaries, at certain times of the year, summer being a good time.
A person wearing a dark red jacket sits in front of a screen display. Text overlays are visible on the right side of the frame, though partially cut off. The setting appears to be an indoor presentation or interview space.
Do this. People trek further up into the mountains, and up there you have plants that you just don't find down here. In fact, there are some plants that are endemic to the tops of those peaks right up here. You don't find them anywhere else on Earth because they're completely isolated from other mountain ranges all around this area, so they become completely isolated. But people would go up there and gather plants for medicines. They would gather a certain kind of grass, bear grass, that's especially tough and sharp, very good for making real rigorous baskets, real tough ones. Also, people would use that for making designs on baskets because it takes dye well, so you can dye it a certain color and do all the ornate basket work. And up on these ridges along the Coast Range here, people also went up and, gathered onions. Onion Peak is called Onion Peak because of the fact that the whole side of that thing is all private timberland on the way up there, so it's hard to go look at this, but you stand at the base of some of these basaltic outcrops that go up 500 feet above your head, and it's real rough rock, and each little pocket on the side of that rock has a little bit of dirt, and each little bit of dirt has an onion growing out the side of it. And it's a pretty cool spot. And people would go up there and gather large quantities of these onions, which can be eaten just like our own onions. The tops can be eaten like green onions, the little bulb can be used like a white onion. And so that was being gathered up there, but also there were hunting areas up there, elk hunting areas, and we even have stories about people going out and hunting the ridge tops, kind of like you hear about the buffalo further east. People would actually flush those elk off the tops of the cliffs, chase them places where they knew they would have to go around some corner or around another rock, and then, there's a blind corner there that goes off the edge of the cliff, and people knew where those things were, and they would chase the elk over the edge. Some of those cliffs are actually high enough, it's hard for me to imagine. Hard for me to imagine picking up the elk at the bottom. But that was done. And also, up to the tops of those mountains, you have a lot of different places that were being visited for ritual purposes as well. There are a lot of other important places like that, and a lot of stories tied to each one of those peaks. And so, all of that was part of this continuous process of using the land year after year, going in these cycles, going to these different places and taking care of different areas as people move around. And so each part of these journeys that people would take across the landscape cumulatively provided them with all the things they needed, all the food they needed, all the medicines they needed, all the clothing they needed, and so forth. And so I may actually cut things a little bit short here. I do want to get into questions, and I also see the next speaker showing up. But I should say, though, as a closing, though, that all this knowledge I'm talking about, I guess, it's interesting. People talk with me about these kinds of tribal traditions, and are they relevant today? And they often.
A person in a maroon shirt and blue jeans stands at a microphone, gesturing with both hands while speaking. Behind them is a dark wooden podium with partial text visible on a banner, and a brass-colored object on a shelf.
I seem to think that this is kind of antiquated stuff, or something out of the distant past. But like I'm suggesting, there are a lot of things that can be learned from this sort of knowledge. We're looking at ways of taking care of the fish. We have stories about simple things that seem fairly basic to us, and yet they tell you how to take care of your family. I was mentioning the importance of not overexploiting the fish because of not just this sort of big cosmological concern about the fish, but because of the practical necessity. You need those fish to come back. You need to maintain that kind of relationship with those fish in order to keep yourself fed. But we also have stories about, for example, tsunamis here. There's a story about a tsunami that takes place down near Indian Beach or Ecola Point, down south towards Canada Beach, Ecola Park, that area, about a tsunami coming in, and there's a place called the Baskets there, a lot of rocks that look like overturned baskets if you look out there from Ecola Point in Ecola State Park. And the stories describe people seeing all of the water sweeping out. And we know now, having seen what's taken place when tsunamis happen around the world, we know that the water sweeps out first when a tsunami is going to happen. That's the dip before the crest comes. And so the water starts to drop and drop and drop and drop. And you hear this story all over the world, actually, because there are different times in history where people see that happen and they don't know what that means. And they get really excited because you can go out in places you've never gone to before. And so there's a story from who knows how far back. I assume it describes a real event, a real tsunami, because it's so accurate. But they describe that water starting to fall, going down and down and down and down. And the people in the communities down in that area, and we know there are several villages down near Cannon Beach, get excited about that, and they tell their young women, look, there are mussels all over the rocks. It's a great time for gathering because look at all those places you can get to that you never were able to get to before. And all the young women go out to the rocks and start gathering. And all of a sudden, they see that wave come up. And it sweeps up. And we know this has happened many times before on this coast because we find the sand, we find the drift logs, sometimes a mile or two inland. And that wave comes in and it takes them all. And in the story then, only a few people survive. They go up high and survive, and when they come back down, they stand on the beach and they cry for the young people who've been lost.
A person in a maroon jacket stands on a stage, gesturing while speaking. Behind them is a dark panel with partial text visible reading Answer, Army, Ipart, and Jajim. Lighting equipment is visible above.
Cry for all those people. And if any of you know Cannon Beach, you know that one of the things that's always in the tourist brochures is as you walk over the sand, it makes this squeaking sound as you walk. And people have talked about that as the crying sands of Cannon Beach. And in this story, they explain that. They say those are the crying sands. That's the sound of those people crying for the people that were lost out there in that tsunami. And when you tell stories like that to young people, you don't need to drill them on what to do in the event of a tsunami. When you tell young people stories like that, you don't have to worry about them getting excited and running out to check out what's going on down there because they have this powerful lesson. And not only do they have this powerful lesson, but every time they walk up the beach, they're thinking about that lesson. They're hearing that sound in that sand. They're being reminded of that story you've told them. And that's pretty powerful because it teaches people what to do and how to survive. And we know that because these tsunamis do happen every 300-500 years in this stretch of coastline, there are times when you actually have to worry about that. When suddenly, after maybe a whole generation hasn't seen it, that water starts to drop back. And I tell you that now. I tell you the story coming back from who knows how many generations of Clatsop and Chinookan people. You see that water dropping, keep that in mind and get to high ground. So that knowledge is passed down in that way. The knowledge is passed down in other ways. And one of the things when you go to Boy Scout camp, they teach you around this part of the world, you can always eat the blueberries. If you find a blueberry out in the woods, it's almost always edible. White berries, you don't usually want to mess with those. And in fact, in the oral traditions of the tribes right here, they talk about the white berries as being the berries of dead people. Dead people who die eat those white berries, that's their food. So you don't mess with that. And then as you're taught in Boy Scout camp, those red berries, you kind of have to know your berries. Some red berries are good. Some red berries are very good. Some red berries are poisonous, or at least will make you very sick. And here too, the elders came up with a way of dealing with this. They tell stories about Helko around here, the wild woman, kind of like Tsunamis up north, if you know that name, like a Bigfoot character, but a woman, sharp teeth, sticks, moss in her hair, extremely strong and dangerous, and liable to even eat children. And their stories say those berries are Helgo's berries. All the berries that are red out in the forest, she thinks are hers. And so you never eat those berries in the forest. If you're out in the forest walking around, you don't just pop one of those in your mouth. The only place where it's safe to eat a red berry is if you take all your berries and go back home with the rest of your family inside your longhouse. That's the safe place to eat those berries. Because otherwise, she's out there in the woods, she'll see you eat her berries, she'll get upset, and she'll come after you. But wait.
A person wearing a dark red shirt stands on a stage with their hands raised while speaking. Behind them is a dark podium and a light gray wall with partial text visible on the sides.
What does that do effectively? That makes sure that every time that little kids are out in the woods gathering red berries, they don't just start eating them randomly out in the woods. They bring it all home where their parents are, where their grandparents are, to watch what they're eating, to make sure it's okay. So a lot of these stories too, you go through and read stories in collections of tribal tales, and it's like, well, what's this crazy stuff about some wild woman who likes to eat children and thinks the red berries are hers? That's crazy, but the more you look at this stuff, the more you understand what's actually out there on the ground, the real hazards to children out there on the landscape. That's where this stuff is coming from, and a lot of that stuff is pretty sophisticated. It reflects the fact that people spent generation after generation figuring out how this stuff works. And then how do you tell children something about that, or how do you explain to your community about that in a way that's going to stay with them, that's going to remind them, that's going to keep them safe for generations to come, and looking after those children and grandchildren. And so I think that there is a lot that we can still learn from this oral tradition. And not just the tribal people, although for them it is an important part of their heritage, but I think that this oral tradition, the Clatsop people, when Lewis and Clark came here, we know that they were very good at sharing. They took good care of their guests. They kept an eye on Lewis and Clark. They made sure they had food coming and going. And they did the same for a lot of families. They did it for my family. They did it for all the different explorers coming through early on, And I find today the elders who are still tied into these traditions are happy to see the rest of us paying attention to them. Because we all live here now. We live in this place, we share this landscape with the people who lived here for generation after generation after generation. In a way, those mountains we see around us, that water in front of us, those are the things we share with those past generations, as well as a concern about our children, concern about our grandchildren, those fundamental human things. And the point of view of these elders is, you now have to live on this land. You now have to take care of this land too. You have to take care of your children and grandchildren. And so we can all gain things from this. We can all be inheritors of this oral tradition, reflecting generation after generation of experimentation, having to live on the land, having to deal with the consequences if you overharvest the fish, if you eat the wrong berry, if you run out when the tsunami's coming in. And now we are all inheritors of that. And stories that have been passed on to me verbally, that came to my ears, now they come out of my mouth to your ears. They're all part of your knowledge as well. So you all have that tradition as part of your knowledge too. And so the oral tradition continues. And just as I said, the Clatsop people aren't extinct.
A person wearing a maroon zip-up jacket speaks while standing indoors. Behind them is a dark panel with partially visible text mentioning core and other words, along with what appears to be a potted plant on the right side.
I send this all over, so too their oral traditions carry on, but in ways they probably could never have imagined. So anyway, I open it up for questions. Yeah.
For time, are you trained to tell stories?
I heard that. Did everybody else? He was asking, is there a time when youth are trained to tell stories? And the truth is that storytelling is a fundamental focal point of social life within the traditional way. And that, especially at this time of the year, as we get into the winter, and again, it's hard for me to help you envision this because we're having winter, or we're not having winter weather, we're having weather that's kind of like our springtime. But ordinarily, we have, and we will probably in a couple of days, in fact, if you stick around, we'll have wind blowing, wind often howling out of the south as these fronts come in off the ocean, rain falling horizontally. It's a very good time to go indoors and tell stories. And for this reason, actually, one of the sets of stories I didn't even really get into today, but it's very important in terms of this kind of teaching I'm talking about, is a whole series of stories among the tribes about South Wind, who is in fact their trickster character, like coyote further east or raven further north. South wind is here all the time in the winter, blowing, making your house rattle, making the smoke back up and billow into your home. And so you can't forget about south wind. South wind is everywhere. And south wind is the one in the stories who creates a lot of the landforms out there on the ground and teaches people about how to live and how not to live. And he'll steal somebody's fish, for example, and then run down the beachways and fall asleep because he's so full he has to sort of sleep it off. And he'll wake up encased in rock. And he'll have to break his way out of that rock, calling upon the generosity of various people who've just about had it with him. And it's a long negotiation process to get chipped out of that rock. So there those rocks are at the mouth of Tillamook Bay. And every time somebody goes in and out of that bay, they're reminded of that story. You don't take somebody's food like that without permission. You don't take things that people need. And if you do, you're going to spend a lot of time negotiating yourself out of a pit or out of a chunk of rock to come to the surface. So that knowledge is all there on the landscape. But the south winds would be blowing all winter long while these stories are being told. So a lot of this knowledge is being discussed, being passed along around the fires in the wintertime. And in fact, in this part of the world, more so than in some other tribes I've worked with, some tribes, stories are told and the children learn those stories just by hearing them over and over again. Here, there was so much of a premium placed on passing down the information very accurately that they would actually drill children sometimes in learning these stories line by line, so that they would learn them rote, so that the next storyteller would know those stories just perfectly. And for that reason, it's really interesting because
A person in a dark red shirt stands in profile, gesturing with their hand while speaking. Behind them is a dark panel with partial text visible reading natural. Conserva. Department, and other fragments.
I can go back to old archival accounts. Somebody interviewing one elder in 1900, another elder in 1930, and you can almost get the exact same wording. Boom, 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 boom. And it's that kind of cultural knowledge. We don't do that so much in our society with stories. We do that with songs. We can say, oh, what fun it is to ride in a one-horse open sleigh. But we don't teach children to sing, well, it's really great to jump in a sleigh and ride down through the snow with a horse and one is best, kind of fun. You get that kind of rhythm to it, and those things stick in your head. And so that's the way that those things are being passed on to the children. But it's really from infancy on, they're being exposed to these stories. And then some stories are being told out on the landscape. When the landscape feature is there, that story is tied to that landscape feature. But an interesting thing, one last thing I should mention about the south wind stories is that there was a belief that you shouldn't talk about the south wind. You shouldn't retell the south wind cycle out of season, because you'd be inviting misfortune. You, in fact, would cause it to go back to wintertime, because that's a wintertime story. So if you start telling south wind stories, the wind may go south on you, and you'll be having to huddle indoors again, because that's the time. So many questions here.
I have a question right here.
How long does do the waves stay out in a tsunami before they come in? How do they have enough time to go out there and fiddle around with shells?
We don't have a geologist, or do we have a geologist in the crowd? It's a few minutes, not very long. And it depends on the size of the wave and the variety of things, but it's a few minutes.
I heard in an earlier presentation the importance of the cedar tree.
That's right.
And I was wondering if there's any traditions you can share in terms of a relationship with either forest management or even cedar.
Well, that's a good point. I brought along some cedar. I brought along several pieces of trees. People thought I was going to give like a wreath-making demonstration or something, but I'll hand this out. These are 2 pieces of cedar gathered right in the middle of an area that I know.
A person in a burgundy shirt sits indoors, facing left. Behind them is a dark panel with gold text reading Service of Engineers and partial text of the interior and bow of below. Fluorescent lighting is visible above.
I was in the Halem cedar gathering area at one time. The cedar trees, there's so much there I could do a whole separate talk just on the cedar trees, because the cedar trees were the source of the wood for the houses, the canoes, the the bark can be peeled off, and if you pound it just right, soften it up, the fibers come loose, and it's almost like cotton. You can weave things with it. You can weave baskets and hats and all sorts of things. The greenery has medicinal uses. And so almost everything that a person might hope for in terms of material culture, in terms of those items you want to make for your living, are found in the cedar tree. And there were a lot of different relationships with those cedar trees that are worth mentioning. I'll just touch on a couple here. Again, just like the fish, the traditional worldview is that these cedar trees are sentient. They give themselves willingly.
A person in a maroon shirt stands indoors, speaking with hand gestures. Behind them is a presentation screen displaying partial text including natural, Asian, core, department O, enchment D.
So that we may have those things. And so people didn't kill a cedar tree unless they absolutely had to. And so, for example, around here, people would take planks off the sides of the trees without killing the whole tree. Or they take cedar bark off the side of the tree. That's actually possible. You can come up to these cedar trees, and up in British Columbia, you'll still find places where people still have done this recently enough. You can find the scars on the side of the tree. But you can come up to the side of the tree, put in some wedges, hit them up, and it has such a long straight grain that starts to split off the tree a little bit. And because these people had a lot of patience, I guess you could say. The tree sways back and forth, and over time that splits a little bit, and then maybe come back the next day.
A person in a maroon shirt gestures while speaking at what appears to be an indoor presentation. Text visible on a screen behind them references U.S. Army Corps, Department of Energy, and Department of Affairs.
Boom! Knock those wedges up a little bit more, and that tree keeps doing that until finally, pop, they take off that whole plank. Cedar bark is the same way. You're going to make clothing out of it. You only take what you need off of one side of the tree, and over time that cedar bark closes up. The tree heals that up. It takes a long time, but that can be done. And if people were taking these things, there are actually certain things, apologies you make to the cedar tree, saying, I'm sorry, I'm doing this to you, but I really need this for my family, and we'll do this respectfully, and we'll still take good care of it and take that stuff home. I should also say that the cedar trees for the canoes and other woods where you really need a good strong wood, people would often go way up into the interior. It's another use of the mountains I didn't mention.
A person in a maroon-colored shirt stands at a microphone, gesturing with their hands while speaking. Behind them is a display board with partial text visible about Department of the Interior and Corps of Engineers.
Even though there were cedar trees down here, people often went way inland because the cedar tree is growing on the real rocky, higher elevation areas. They had to struggle. They grow slower because it's colder, rockier, and what that means when it grows slower is that the rings are tighter. Less growth each year, less buildup of new wood. And so if you're a canoe builder, that's a good thing because that means you have really tight-grained wood, very strong wood. And so people would actually go way into the interior and chop these trees down. I work with one elder up north who still remembers doing this with his grandfather, where they went clear up a mountain and they knocked over the tree, and then it hangs up on the brush, and they chop the brush, and it takes about a day, and then the tree slides halfway down the hill. They go down the hill, and they set up another base camp. They clear the brush there out of the way, push it, rock it, and pretty soon it slides the rest of the way down to the waterfront, and then they can start working on their canoe. It takes 2 or 3 days to get that log just down to the water, and then they float it down the river, down to the village where they can work on it. So that wood was the premium stuff. And there were stories that children would be taught, again, about these plants, which I won't even get into, but there are stories about the cedar trees at different times, and the spruce trees, and all the other trees, when they're still speaking, being asked, actually by that same wild woman character. She has gotten her face tattooed, and she wants to ask them what they think of it. Of course, she's pretty horrific looking anyway, and now she's got her face tattooed. And she asks each of the trees in turn, what do you think of my new tattoos? And hemlock tree, which I don't have here, has the bad sense to tell her what he really thinks. And she says, in the future, your wood is going to be totally useless. When winds blow, you fall right over. Nobody will make medicine out of you. You're not good for much of anything. But cedar tree has tact. Cedar tree knows what to say. He says, I think you look great. This is always the right answer, isn't it? says, I think you look great with those tattoos. And she says, very good. And you're going to have strong wood in the time to come when people are here. This is before people arrive. People will make canoes out of you. They'll make medicine out of your greenery. They'll make clothing out of your bark. And you'll be honored by all these people who will show you this kind of respect. And so the same thing happens with spruce. This tree is everywhere around here. Spruce, very pokey. I'll hand these around. Spruce also has the good sense to say fairly positive things. Spruce is not given as many.
A person in a maroon jacket stands at a podium with potted plants on either side. They gesture with both hands while speaking. Text overlays on the dark background list government agencies and departments.
Attributes of cedar, but spruce, it's a great tree. And a lot of the uses are medicinal. Pitch, very important medicine. Spruce trees, in some cases, people would go up and put ceremonial regalia in the branches because it's a powerful tree and you want those things out of the mundane world, off the dirt, off the ground. And in some cases, people even bury people up in trees, up in the branches of these spruce trees with broad lateral branches sticking out. And they lay those canoes or boxes right in the arms of that tree to take care of it. So that's very pokey. By the way, I warn you that a lot of the native names for this plant up and down the coast translate to the plant that really, really, really hurts when you grab onto it. So as this goes around, be forewarned. That's why I've stripped the stems for you.
This will be our last question.
Okay.
Can you give us a glimpse of what it was like for families living in the longhouse seasonally, how it would change?
Yeah, the long.
A person wearing a dark red shirt sits on stage, looking downward. Behind them is a dark panel with gold trim and partial text visible referencing government agencies and services.
Longhouses around here, they varied in size a lot. There was the wintered longhouse, where the larger families gathered together. And those were all made out of these big cedar planks. They were often big, open rooms. Some of the really big ones were as big as the interior of this tent. And you'd have extended families in them, often 2 or 3 fires in a row down the middle. Some kind of large, broad bench structure around the perimeter, which served as sleeping platforms. And often there were places to store things underneath that, over the top of that, and so forth. And then there were rooms often partitioned off with smaller poles and woven mats made out of various grasses, even sometimes these guys. And so you have whole extended families there. In the wintertime, it's sort of a combined residential space and storage space because there's so much. It's not the time of year when you're gathering food, it's the time when you're living off of stored provisions. So there were boxes all over, often big, what they call bent wood boxes made out of cedar planks that would be taken off the tree, heated up, and then bent. So that you take a single plank and you bend it until you get a box, and then you put the top and bottom on, and you get a nice wooden box, and then people will be living off of the food, or off the food in those boxes. And those boxes would be decked out on those platforms, and under those platforms, and above those platforms, around where people were gathered. And so in the wintertime, people were living off of those, telling the stories around the fires, and holding winter ceremonials, often when the biggest homes, which happened to be the homes of the more powerful families, were hosting potlatch kind of events where they're exchanging goods. Thank you. And also shamanistic work, where they're going through and bringing in shamans to do healing work and that kind of thing in the winter. And as we get into the springtime, people begin to mobilize. They go to fishing places and plant gathering areas. And so there are fewer people there at the larger houses, but then you have temporary encampments, smaller houses. There are temporary encampments like this that used to be all over the place. And so you can still see where some of them are as you walk over the landscape. And some of those they look like simple shed structures, often like the size of a garden shed sometimes, where you have a family just sleeping for a couple of nights, doing some fishing, doing some plant gathering, maybe a simple shed-style roof slope like this, rather than like this. And they would move around between different locations where they had fishing stations and so forth, and then people moving up into the interior as well. Sometimes in the hottest days of summer, people sleeping out with kind of mat coverings, again, those woven mats being used over a pole frameworks way
A person in a maroon jacket stands on a stage with both fists raised at shoulder height. Behind them is a projected screen with partial text visible. Another person's head is visible in the lower right corner.
The interior, fishing stations, and so forth. In the big villages, though, at that time, people would still be there. Sometimes people would pop the boards off the roof, so you got better aeration. And sometimes if people were going to go for a major fishing junket, they might even pull some of the boards off and take them with them to go lean up to make the walls of the other structure they're going to live in. So they'd actually pick up those boards. It takes a lot of work to get one of those cedar planks off of a tree, so you don't just have, a bunch of them here, a bunch of them there, a bunch of them here. You sometimes have to take some with you to go where you want to go. And so in those different places, you'd have smaller groups of family, and then in the larger house, you'd have a few people still hanging out, usually elderly, children, those kinds of things, sticking close to home. And then as you get into the wintertime, then everybody begins to regroup, and sometimes people who haven't seen each other for quite a while, for weeks or months, would regroup, and then those extended families are back together in a larger village where they spend the year, the rest of the year. So.
Let's say it, we're out of time. Should we have questions for Doug? He might be able to